This session will be recorded so that we can share it out with folks who are planning on doing their looking at it for their own version of giving a racial and economic justice 30-minute drop-in. So we're gonna get started here, but thank you all for being here and let's dive in. All right. We're going to begin with the native land acknowledgement. We begin by acknowledging the indigenous peoples, the Dakota and the Anishinaabe, on whose land we meet. We are called on to learn and share what we learn about tribal history, culture, and contributions that have been suppressed in telling the story of America. We thank them and their relatives for their care of the land, and we recognize their continuing connections to the land, waters, and community. And our code of conduct. The Minnesota AFL-CIO is committed to providing an environment free from discrimination and harassment. We ask all meeting participants to embrace our values of equity and equality and conduct themselves in this meeting consistent with those values. As we work towards equity, individuals are still being harmed by racism, sexism, and other systems of oppression based on their identities. Meeting participants will be impacted differently based on their identities, and we commit to the security and safety of those most impacted by oppression. President Burnham has assigned 2 designees as the first point of contact for anyone who thinks they have experienced discriminatory, harassing, or otherwise unacceptable behavior, and we urge you to contact a designee if you have any concerns. And our 2 designees are Bethany Winkles, the Secretary Treasurer with the Minnesota AFL-CIO, and then Andrew Peltier with the Machinist District Lodge 77. All right, so welcome everyone. Today we are going to be doing the 30-minute a version of the 30-minute drop-in that is available on our Better in a Union toolkit, which we will link to at the end of this presentation for folks. And so we have a toolkit that we have available on our website. It has all sorts of really great information for folks that we're really encouraging folks to dive in, take a look at. And the goal here is to really make sure that we give folks tools to be able to have conversations in their workplaces, to be able to talk union with folks. There's a little vocabulary book about, uh, labor vocab and what is a a collective bargaining unit mean and what does this mean? And we have Weingarten rights. What's that? Kind of goes through all of that, as well as some of the union acronyms that we've got so that folks can know what are the unions that are here in Minnesota and what members do we have here, as well as two 30-minute two 30-minute trainings. We did one last week on Better in a Union. And a little bit about the union difference. And then tonight is around racial and economic justice. So we'll talk about a little bit of history. We'll have an exercise and evaluation, and then we'll talk about ways that you can do this work in your own time. So with that, let's get into our next slide. And I'm going to introduce Douglas Williams. He is the co-chair of the Racial and Economic Justice Committee for the Minnesota AFL-CIO. Douglas.
Hello, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Great. I hope everyone is doing good. And so we're going to get into labor and civil rights. The history of the United States from beginning to end is a history of workers and owners and the balance of power between them. Owners have power in our capitalist system because, frankly, they own the capital and they own the means of production. Workers begin taking this power back by organizing themselves and organizing their money. Something that I'm fond of saying or discussing is that, the worker, the rank and file worker, is the only worker in our economic system, the only person in our economic system that makes money from the thing that they produce with their hands, with their tools, with their mind. their boss, their boss's boss, their boss's boss's boss, all the way on up to the CEO. They all make money off of that worker's labor and that worker's time. So if that's the case, why is it that the rank and file worker makes what they make while the bosses make 2, 5, 10, 400 times what that rank and file worker makes, even though they do not physically produce anything on their own, right? That's capitalism. And that's been a driver behind a lot of the inequalities that we have seen, and that part of which are what we're going to discuss here today. Next slide, please. And so, we begin this by discussing how in the United States, the means of production before the Industrial Revolution and before mechanization and automation, it was literal human bodies, right? Chattel slavery was using African slaves as the means of production, as the mode of production, as to how we got goods from raw material to thing that you bought in your farmers markets or shops and things like that. So the first slave ship arrives in the English colony of Virginia in August of 1619, and it carried more than 20 Africans who had been forcibly taken from their homes and their families, and their bodies were sold to captor owner from by captor owners to colonist owners based on the value of their ability to work. And we've heard about these sort of gradations in value for what a human being could go for at these slave auctions. Now, today we think of a work stoppage as a strike, but we think of a work stoppage as a strike because we are ostensibly living in an era where labor is free. But in those days, it wasn't called a strike. It was called a rebellion, right? And so the first recorded slave rebellion in colonial American was called the Servants' Plot in 1663. European indentured servants, African slaves, and Native Americans organized together and confronted their Virginia plantation masters on the tobacco farms. The plot failed when one of the servants betrayed the group. He was rewarded with his freedom and 5,000 pounds of tobacco, while four of the organizers were hung. And so you see this throughout history, right? You see the servants plot. You see the Gloucester County plot. But then you get to instances such as Nat Turner's Rebellion, where Nat Turner uh, organized slaves in Southampton County, Virginia, actually, which is next door to Suffolk, which is where I grew up, and massacred about 4 dozen slave owners, children, wives, families throughout Southampton County. They were eventually put down. They were all executed. And to make the point, they put their heads on pikes and hung them on a road that would become known as Blackhead for the heads that were put on spikes. Um, Gruesome, brutal, right? Such was the nature. of the response of slave capitalism to the cries of freedom. Continue to the next slide, please. The reason we talk about the servant's plot versus Nat Turner's rebellion is that solidarity is the difference between a plot and a rebellion. It is the difference between a conspiracy and an uprising. And in the modern day, it is the difference between a gripe and a grievance and a strike. Next slide, please. And so we get into the Industrial Revolution. We get into wage work. And now workers start sort of organizing along occupational and class lines. Factory workers had no protections. They were paid wages, working long hours for low pay. Obviously, these workers were by and large white because this is a category that excludes the enslaved and people still working under indentured servant contracts. And this time, child labor was rife. Uh, Children worked and died often working in these factories. The first recorded organized wage worker work stoppage, what we would now refer to as a strike, was in 1768 when New York tailors protested wage cuts by stopping work. Um, we should also recognize that, if anyone's ever seen Matewan, the movie about the miners' strikes in southern West Virginia at the beginning of the 20th century, you notice that when they bring in strike breakers and they bring in scabs to do the work, those scabs were black. So it was in this era as well. The workers would subcontract out slaves in order to hire them for work, regardless of whether they were on strike. All of those profits, all of those wages went back to the slave owners. They never went to the slaves that were being worked, that were actually doing the work. As you can see in this photograph, a lot of the work done at this time was done by women. Women and people of color have always experienced precarious working conditions, especially when you consider that a lot of this work was being done inside of the home, where the rights of workers inside of the home were absolutely at that point non-existent. Next slide, please. And so, as factories grew, women's employment in them grew as well. So what you see here is the mill girls and the Lowell mill strikes in Massachusetts in 1834. Now, where a lot of these factories got their workforce from in these textile mills were from uh, rural farmers and rural farms and the daughters and women who worked on those farms in like the slow season, outside of harvest season. They would go to the textile mills in Lowell and other areas in and around Boston in order to make extra money for the family when harvesting was not occurring. They organized a strike to protest wage cuts and working conditions. Uh, on the whole, was the strike successful? Well, not in the ways in which we would traditionally think of a strike to be successful, because a lot of the women who walked out of the job, they never returned to work. Those who did return to work received a lower rate of pay. So, in a sense, the strike was a failure, but in one big sense, it was a massive history-making success because what it did was it showed the power of collective action, and it helped to spread the gospel of collective action to a new generation of workers as they started going into an era where women where white women and then people of color began to gain more rights as we fought things like the Civil War and the movement for suffrage, and then eventually the movement for civil rights. Next slide, please. And that's where we start to get the 14th Amendment, right? I always like to say the closest thing that we have had to something approaching a proletarian revolution in this country is the Civil War. Um, the Civil War was fought explicitly on the terms of freeing slaves and bringing about equality amongst workers in the United States, right? Regardless of whether you're black or you're white. After the defeat of the Confederacy and the signing of the surrender in Appomattox on April 9th, 1865, Congress then got to work, particularly the radical Republican wing of Congress got to work on adding amendments to the Constitution that would buttress and support the newfound freedom given to millions and millions of enslaved workers. These became known as the Reconstruction Amendments. And for our purposes, the most important one is the 14th Amendment. Why is that important? Because if you think about it, equal protection under the law, that is a concept that is baked into the 14th Amendment. And it is something that has been the foundation for not only anti-discrimination laws, collective bargaining laws, and other labor laws, such as those limiting the amount of working hours and the use of child labor, but it also helped those laws to survive judicial review. It would also result in freedmen, the newly freed slaves, going on to found their own labor organizations throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. So just like you had the National Labor Union founded by William Silvis as the first sort of attempt at creating a national labor union. So you also had the Colored National Labor Union that was founded in Baltimore not long after that. When you think about the populist movement and the Populist Party and the Greenback movement and stuff like that, those organizations, largely focused in the rural South, also had Black components to them, like Black sort of sister organizations. So you had a labor movement that was more inclusive, but they weren't integrated. You had a labor movement that ran in parallel with one another, with organizations that had that were restricted to white workers, and then organizations that also had that were restricted to black workers. But as we start to see at the beginning of the civil rights movement, a lot of these barriers begin to come down. Next slide, please. Perhaps the greatest example of this partnership is described in the photo that you see. We talk about the March on Washington a lot. Talk about the March on Washington a lot in American history. What a lot of people don't talk about is the full name of the March on Washington, which was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And this was originally planned as a pressure tactic in order to force the desegregation of the armed forces. The notion that we should not be going to die for a country that won't even allow us to use a water fountain when we get back, right? So it was a pressure tactic to force the desegregation of the armed forces, but it was preempted by Executive Order 8802, which desegregated the armed forces. But as the civil rights movement gained steam and gained momentum, first with bus boycotts, and then with protest and boycott movements that got going in places like Birmingham or Atlanta or Charleston, South Carolina, Albany, Georgia, and places like that, it was decided that we needed a massive action, demonstration, protest, and movement in order to bring these issues to a head. And we need to do it in the place that's the seat of our government, which is Washington, D.C. So it was in 1963 with the March on Washington with Jobs and Freedom. Now, some unions have begun to already desegregate their unions. My union, so I'm an international representative with the Machinist Union in our organizing department. Our union had begun to dismantle the color bar in our union in 1948, right? You start to see after this March on Washington, more unions beginning to take whatever formal color bar that they have either in their constitutions or in their sort of um, operational documents. They start to take those things out, and the labor movement starts to look like the kaleidoscope of working people, of the working class that it is today. Next slide, please. And that brings us to today. You know, I can't think, it's hard to do this slide. It's hard to do this presentation. This is the first time I've taught this. Since the murders of Alex Preddy, union member, and Renee Good, people who were murdered by the state, who were murdered by our federal government because they had the temerity to stand up for their neighbors. This is no different than the murder of Viola Liuzzo. This is no different than the murders of Mickey Schwerner and Andrew Goodman. This is no different than the murder of James Reeb. This is no different than the stuff that we faced 60, 70 years ago, where we had people of all walks of life, of all colors, who came into this movement and said that if this is to be a movement, a true movement of the working class, then this must be a movement of all the working class, not just the white working class, not just the privileged. This has to be a movement of everybody if this is to be a movement rooted in solidarity. If you ain't got solidarity, you ain't got shit. And it's as simple as that. And the interlinking of our struggles between these two movements continues today, to this day. And I would beseech you to continue that work, whether it's in your communities, in your local lodges, in your workplaces. Solidarity has to be something more than a song we sing at our conventions. It has to be something that is made real. And I hope that what I've given you throughout this training will assist you in making that solidarity real and getting us closer to our liberation as workers, as humans. We are more than a line item on some CEOs or CFO spreadsheet. We are human beings deserving of all the rights, dignity, and respect that should be afforded to us simply by the virtue that we breathe, that we born, that we are in society. Thank you very much.
So we're going to move into a pair exercise here. We're going to break folks up into small groups. Um, we're going to have practice navigating divide and conquer politics because at the end of the day, that is what a lot of divisive things that we're hearing around, that's what the heart of what it is. It is so that the oppressors can continue to keep us apart, so that they can continue to subjugate us. And so we're going to share some in the chat. I'm going to share some examples of some things you might hear in the workplace. Why do we always have to talk about race? We need to care about our own people first? That joke wasn't just offensive, it wasn't offensive. People are just too sensitive now. Older workers are out of touch. Young workers just don't care about working anymore. Have any of you heard any of these things in the workplace?
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm seeing nods, right? So we're going to break into groups and we're going to practice for about 10 minutes here, where folks can really go back and forth with your partner sharing. Um, and then we're going to come back together and we're going to share how that exercise went. And then some ways that we can bring some of this stuff to us in the work site, but also ways in which we can use this toolkit. So we're going to break out into groups for about 10 minutes here. How did it go?
Helpful.
Did anyone's partner say something really insightful?
My partner had a very analytical approach to it. I mean, he had a very detailed understanding of the issue and had some experiences.
What was your question, Bill, that you were talking about? I don't think we all had the same topic.
It was about forget how it was phrased, but it was about the differences. It wasn't just there's race, there's gender, there's political ideas and that. So how to deal with all of those need to be addressed. And you can't substitute one for the other and say, well, we're going to work on this one, or this is more important.
What I shared with Andrea and Katie is even after all these years, and you've all heard me say this before, but even in the work that we do every day, the why do we always have to talk about race makes me insane. And I'm really just tired of the conversation, and yet you still have to have it today, all the time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like now too we're having a lot of backsliding, where, people are walking around admitting that they belong to the Ku Klux Klan and using language that we had kind of stopped using at least publicly maybe 20 years ago, and now they're all spouting up their hate speech again. I think it's like they have a license to act up now, you know.
Yeah, I think that sometimes those really out in the open racist things can feel really tough and hard, especially because it can feel like we're going backwards. But I know for one thing that I've noticed in particular that I find particularly insidious is the really subtle stuff where it's like harder to point out why it's racist,
Mhm.
right? I come from the Teamsters, and we have members of all types. And you know, there are some who are much more conservative, and I've gotten into a lot of conversations where folks have had a lot of very strong and angry opinions about some of the things that I believe and some of the candidates that we have stood for instance. And uh, yeah, it can feel hard to try to explain to folks that like well, yeah, you know, the OK symbol is actually a symbol that some people use for racism. And some people are like, well, I use it. I'm not racist. And then trying to explain to folks, like, sure. And it doesn't mean it's not being used as a symbol for folks to identify with each other. And part of why it's working is because it's harder for us to point it out, right? Microaggressions, yeah, absolutely. Um, you know, the things where it's like little things here or there where it doesn't like it's not someone outright like calling someone a slur, but it is like, have you heard anyone ever say like, "Oh, you sound so like well informed," or "You talk really well," to like a black person, for instance?
Yeah.
Like you sound like you talk really like you sound really like smart, like you
Can
talk really
I can I say something?
well.
I get that all the time. I
Mhm.
get that all the time. Like you're very articulate, and
And
I'm like,
articulate, that was the word I was looking for. You're so articulate.
okay. Or I get that. Oh, you sound very white, and I'm like, but I
He's
Ooh, ooh.
I get that one a lot. Or oh, you're not like them.
mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
get that one too.
We all listen, I got aunt, we all got one who is like, well, my cousin's adopted from Guatemala, and she'll be like, well, I not your kind of immigrant. And it's like, okay, honey, let's have some conversations here about why that is a really problematic way to point that out, right? Yeah, and those
I got I have so many stories. I'm a Black American. Like I was Christian and converted into Muslim. Like I have so many stories I could tell you of what I went through. So
yeah,
it's just, but yeah,
yeah,
thank you. I'm going to hide again.
that is thank you for sharing that. And that is like 100% like I think it's those more insidious things where especially like those of us who are white may not necessarily see it as quickly, right? But it like pops up into our head like it is more insidious and it can be more difficult to help navigate, right, in these conversations. And I often find that those are the tougher ones to have the conversations with. So when we're keeping an eye out and ways to navigate work site, like if hearing things like being like surprised at how articulate a person of color sounds, like perhaps not judging somebody by the color of their skin of the level of education or the different things that they were able to go through in their lives, like, you know, or what do we call consider articulate and like really like calling those questions out. Like, are we um pushing away like a large swath of the ways in which people utilize language and making it adding barriers unnecessarily. There's a lot of questions that, you know, we can ask ourselves and we can also hear people talking about at work, right? And I think the most important thing is like how are we talking about the ways in which we all have differences, right? That is part of what makes us beautiful when we come together because we can see things that other people can't. And that's how a plan can be right? That's how a movement can be more well planned and can navigate a boss better because they can see things that other people wouldn't, right? And so making sure we have those differences in opinions and making safe spaces for that is part of our role if we want to build solidarity-based spaces where folks feel comfortable and feel like they are in community with their fellow union members. So I think let's go to the reflection slide, Shields. Well, that was it, folks. That was our 30-minute drop-in. We have these available, all the words right on the toolkit, so you can go and do this yourself. But I wanted to ask, what did you learn? Was there anything surprising, anything really challenging? Is there anything that maybe we missed in this short little session that we could work on for a future version?
The review of history, of racist history, and efforts at liberation and integration and racial justice was fascinating to me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we're really lucky to have we got to work with a phenomenal training director, Robin Gully, who's currently running for state senate, who used to work with us, as well as Douglas Williams. He is our co-chair for the Racial and Economic Justice Committee, but he comes from union education as a background. He's like a union educator by trade, so I think it's really a boon that we have him who helped us put this content together as well, and so. Yeah.
I really appreciated the session. The only thing that I would hope for is kind of like a part two that might go more in depth about, especially I think resources in Minnesota, both at maybe the state and federal level, like the EEOC and different things like that, and how to navigate those resources. I think that is something also I'd be really interested to hopefully learn about.
That's really useful. I think we'll definitely take that down into consideration. We've launched this toolkit. It's live. We've got a whole digital ads that we've been putting around why around what it means to be in a union, what that union difference is, why it's better in a union. We also have an action page where folks can sign on to support things like unemployment insurance for workers who go on strike, as well as record their own videos about what it's like, why it's important and better for them to be in a union, as well as to check the toolkit out. There's a debrief form there as well, so folks take it, hop into it, piece through it. If you have other feedback, you can go directly through there as well. And we really hope you take this and run with it, and bring it to your own local unions, to your own work sites, or wherever. Read parts of it with friends as a book club, however it makes sense. And these slides will also be available with the toolkit. There's like notes and everything in it so that folks can just kind of run things through the way that we did, nice and easy. So, well, thank you everyone for participating. We hope we see some of you soon at either the National AFL-CIO convention coming up here in a couple weeks, or at our Racial and Economic Justice All-Day Seminar in June, in the end of June. So thank you so much. Please use this toolkit and let us know ways that we can continue to be engaged with you all.